Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Dan Rodney and welcome to the live stream given by Noble Desktop for web animation. Today we're going to be talking about ways to animate in web pages and emails, and we've got a packed 2 hours for you today. Lots of good information. Just a couple things before we get started. For those of you who are attending the live stream, I do try to keep an eye on the chat as we're going through, and I'll answer questions. If for some reason I miss it or I just don't answer it, we'll have some Q&A time at the end as well. There is a presentation that I'm going to be, a slide deck that I'm going to be using. For those of you that are in the chat live, I just pasted it into the chat, and for anybody watching the recording, it's also in the video description down below. You can just click on that link to view the slides. There's lots of information in the slide deck, and I'll be switching over to share my screen here in just a moment to go through that with you. For those of you who might not be familiar with Noble Desktop, let me just take a few seconds just to introduce Noble Desktop. We're a training center in New York City. Now, if you're not in New York City or somewhere else in the world, you can still learn with us through these live streams, but also through our in-person classes. A lot of people attend them live, but you can also attend those online as well. So you can attend them live, basically live stream the class. So you can hear the instructor talking, see their screen, and you can attend most of our classes as a live stream. You do have to attend in New York City time, that's Eastern time, just like the people that are attending in person live. We also have great workbooks that you can learn from, and those are all step-by-step, and you can check them out on our website. We've been teaching this kind of stuff for the past 27 years, and let me go ahead and get started now with the actual content here. I'm sure you're excited to get going. I'm going to switch over to do a screen share. And so here you can see this is the slide presentation that, once again, for those of you attending live, I'll paste it again into the chat. Just keep that link around for the future, bookmark it. It will also be in the video description. It's actually in the video description now of the live stream, but if this is a recording, it's in the video description down below. And we keep this page up so you don't have to worry about it going down. To use this slide deck, you can just use your arrow keys, left and right arrow keys to go back and forth. This cool animation in the background that you can interact with, I liked it and I included it in the background. The only problem with it is if you click on it, it steals your keyboard focus, so then the arrow keys don't work. So if you did kind of play around with that, just click anywhere in this main area. So if the keystrokes don't work, just click here and then your keystrokes will work. If you're on a touch device, you could also swipe through this presentation as well. Lots of cool links and useful information here, and part of today will be me going through this slide deck and sharing the information, but also there's going to be live demonstrations as well. So what are we going to do today? We're going to give first an overview of different animation techniques. I'm going to show you different examples and live demonstrations of building animation, so you can actually see what it's like to create these different things. What are some of the ways you can animate on the web? Animated GIFs. They've been around for a really long time. They're still around. They're probably going to be around forever. They're not great for super complex, long animations. They're good for simple animations. And one of the most prevalent uses now is still in HTML emails. So if you get an email with an animation in it, those are animated GIFs typically. And I know that the original creator of animated GIFs called them animated GIFs, but I just can't bring myself to say GIF. I say GIF because GIF peanut butter was already out, and I feel like he just got it wrong, so I say animated GIF, even though the creator of animated GIFs called it GIF. So they're good for simple animations, things that are shorter, not maybe as complex, and but they still work in emails, so they're very heavily used in emails. And still some ad banners are being done with animated GIFs as well, but only the simple ones. In a web page, we make our web pages with three different coding languages: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. HTML is for marking up your content, CSS is for styling that content, and JavaScript is for adding interactivity and animation to that content. Now, CSS started out as a simple styling language to set font size and background colors, background images, and styling the size and position of elements, but it has grown a lot since it was invented, and it has actually added animations. So you can do simple animations with CSS. More complex than animated GIFs. They can be really nice and smooth, high quality animations. But when I do say simple, you're not going to create as kind of long, in-depth chained animations of one thing happening and then another thing happening and another thing happening. With CSS, that becomes a little bit more difficult. In the examples that I'll show you, you'll see that they're kind of better for this somewhat more simple things, which brings us to how do you create complex animations on the web. JavaScript is really the key for creating long, complex things that are chained one event after another, where timing is important. JavaScript is going to be the best way to create these complex animations. Now you can also use Adobe After Effects to create animations, because video works online as well. We see a lot more video now that we have better bandwidth and faster download times. And After Effects can create videos, or you can also turn one of your After Effects animations into an animated GIF. That's one of the things that I'll be showing you today. We'll create an animation in Adobe After Effects and then turn it into an animated GIF using Photoshop. So let's go through some examples of each of these types, starting with animated GIF. This might be what you think of as kind of a simple animated GIF, frame by frame. You show a picture, something changes in each frame. It could be a lot changes or just a little bit changes, but they aren't just limited to this kind of show a picture kind of thing. You could do more complex things like this. This is an animated GIF, but it was created with Adobe After Effects, so it's got a lot more complex animation in it. The thing you have to be careful about is file size in an animated GIF. This, for example, is 2.5 megabytes for this individual image. So whether you're putting it in email or a web page, just consider that file size. One thing that will help you to keep the file size down is limiting your color palette. Animated GIFs can only have 256 colors across all the frames of the entire animation. So it already has a limited color palette, but the GIF format prefers flat, solid colors over gradations. It can't compress gradations very well. It can compress flat, solid areas of color. So if you look at this image, it's primarily made of flat, solid colors. There's not gradients and that type of stuff too much. There are some in the shadows that we've got there. And this was not created by us. This was just an example that I found. But if you look at the total number of colors, there's not a lot of colors in here. So that's some of the ways that they kept the file size down. This would have been even larger had they used more gradients and more colors. So do keep that limitation in mind. The biggest kind of animated GIF that you could create would be maybe a slideshow of photos where you're fading between one photo and another, because every frame of the animated GIF would be basically changing every pixel in the entire animation. The GIF format works by remembering how many pixels change from one frame to the next. So if only a few pixels change from one frame to the next, that doesn't increase file size very much. But if all the pixels from one frame to the next change, then your file size is going to go up dramatically. So it's not the number of frames that you have that solely determines your file size. It's the number of frames you have, but more importantly, it's how many pixels change from frame to frame. So if you go from one photo to another photo on 3 frames, basically all the pixels are probably going to change. That's going to be a big file size. You might have another animation where you might have 50 frames, but not much changes from frame to frame, and that file size might be much smaller. Be careful though if you're doing HTML emails. If you're including an animated GIF in an email, Outlook 2007 and newer only display the first frame of the animated GIF. So this is what people in Outlook 2007 and newer would see. They wouldn't see the rest of the animation. Just keep that in mind because, for example, if you're doing a fade-in style animated GIF where the first frame is basically blank, there's nothing there, and all the elements fade in, people in Outlook 2007 and newer are not going to see the content that you're later going to fade in because they're only going to see the first frame. So maybe that fade in technique isn't the best approach for something like an animated GIF in an email. maybe just doing something where something's animating and it's catching your attention. You're trying to draw the reader in by doing an eye-catching animation rather than fading things in. Here's another example of an animated GIF that was in an HTML email. If you look, even though they are switching from photo to photo to photo, they did restrict the main area of change over here to the right. So that did help to keep down the file size. The rest of the email, or the rest of the animation here is fairly flat and solid in color, which helps the GIF compression to make it smaller. If they wanted to make it even smaller, there is some subtle changes in the gradient that's going on, and they could have maybe done a little bit of retouching to try to completely flatten that out and have that not change from frame to frame, and that could have kept the file size down a little bit more if file size was a problem for this. Now, animated GIFs, they can actually contain videos. Essentially, it's not a video, it's still an animated GIF, but you can turn a video into an animated GIF. Notice the color palette of this is fairly limited. It's primarily blues, and then there's a green in there as well, but it's a limited color palette. It's very short, and those are ways that we kept the file size down to 2.2 megabytes. I've gotten emails, though, where the emails are 5, 7, 8, 9, 10 megabytes for an animated GIF. So just be careful of your file size when you're doing animated GIFs. But yes, you can even include video in an animated GIF. You can turn a video into an animated GIF, which we'll see when we do an After Effects video. We're going to basically render out a video and turn it into an animated GIF. There's some additional examples on different websites that I wanted to link out to. So for example, here, this is an animated GIF from Dior. Let's watch that one more time here. Now, this was not created probably originally as an animated GIF. This was probably a TV commercial or something, or some video that was created and then it was turned into an animated GIF. It's not that they, no, I don't want to subscribe. Oh, I hate those pop-ups. They didn't create this frame by frame as originally an animated GIF. They turned a video into an animated GIF. But that particular animated GIF is 7 megabytes. So that's pretty big. Here's another one. This is an email for Readdle. It's a product that they make called Spark. And this, it looks like a video, but this is actually an animated GIF. There was a video turned into an animated GIF. Just that alone is 6.3 megabytes just for that, not including the other graphics and the HTML and CSS that's included in that. So again, just be careful. And if you look closely, you can see some banding in the rest of the areas because they have some gradations in there and it's limited to 256 colors. So, you know, there's some sacrifices you have to make to create an animated GIF, but you can't reliably put an actual video in an email and have it work in most places. But an animated GIF will work in many more email clients. This is a fun little article about the history of web design. It's kind of fun, actually, if you want to read it. But they have interesting little animations at the beginning of each section. No, I don't want to subscribe. So fun little animations, kind of reminding you of what it is. So some fun stuff for each of those. And those are all animated GIFs. And see, those, they're flat, they're solid, they're simple. These would probably be very, very small file sizes because of the way that they were designed in flat, solid, limited color palette. They would probably download very, very fast. Next up, this one you might not think is an animated GIF, actually. It's a bit different. This animating ribbon over here on the side, that's an animated GIF. It's full screen, it's huge, it's quite nice quality, but it works as an animated GIF because it's primarily flat areas for the most part. There are some gradations in there, but they're all red, so it works within a limited color palette. And even though it's quite large, it's, relatively speaking, from frame to frame, not much is changing. They just add a little bit more or they wipe a little bit away. So not much changes from frame to frame, so that doesn't increase file size very much. So they could afford to do a big animated GIF and not have a huge file size for this. So don't just think of animated GIFs as these tiny little things. You know, you can think of them as bigger, broader things. They're really quite flexible. And so that was only 261K. So it's a quarter of a megabyte. That's really pretty small. Now, Spotify, if you want to advertise on Spotify, they have this page talking about it, and they have these cool animations here. And actually, they have them for each of the 3 sections. So if I go over here to diversity, then they have a different animation there. And if I go up here to tilt, they have this animation here. So those are some pretty cool animations. And with the complexity of this, with the color changes they're doing, this was probably created in something like After Effects to do all of those moving pieces. You can build animations in Photoshop, and maybe this could have been done in Photoshop potentially, but After Effects is better at animating a bunch of things than Photoshop is. Photoshop is kind of, think of it as like Photoshop is like a light version of After Effects as far as this type of stuff goes. It can do some animation, but After Effects is kind of king of animation. So if you were doing more complex stuff, if Photoshop wasn't up to the task, you'd want to bump up to After Effects for doing it. The only problem in this particular case is file size and the way that they coded up the web page. If I have a little note back here. So that bubbles animation is 3.9 megabytes just for that particular animation. And each of the other ones is approximately 4 megabytes. So there's 3 of those. So 3 times 4, it's about 12 megabytes just in those animated GIFs. Now, unfortunately, the way that this web page was coded, and it could have been coded in a different way, they could have coded this properly, but the the desktop version versus the mobile version, they actually have different animations. So if I switch back here to Discovery, notice it's only 1 set of bubbles instead of the 2 sets of bubbles on the left and the right hand side. So because of that, because they actually switched and made a different set of animated GIFs for mobile and desktop, oh yeah, see, they split it into 2. So there's 1 and there's 2. And here, there's 1 here, and there's 1 there. Whereas here, it's all merged into one thing. They actually loaded it twice on mobile and desktop. And so this page is like 27 megabytes. It's a huge web page. That's a coding issue. They could have coded it so that it was hidden on mobile and only shown on desktop. You know, that they'd not load the other files that you didn't see, but that's something for the developers to make sure that they do correctly. But the main thing is just be careful of file size when using animated GIFs. They can get quite large, and so you might want to do something else. So that brings us to CSS. Using cascading style sheets, we can not only style elements on a page, but we can animate elements on a page. The Stripe website is an amazing website. They do all sorts of crazy cool design. You got to check this website out. Just look across all the different pages that they have. They have tons of cool stuff. But this is a really neat page right here with Atlas. So they're going down this road, and the cool thing about this background animation that they're doing is that this like grid road system that they're on, that is actually not created at this kind of angle originally. It was actually created as just 90-degree angles, and it was transformed using cascading style sheets. So it was actually put into perspective using CSS. So they actually kind of did a 3D rotation so that it was, these angles are actually being created by CSS. So all of these lines and everything were just created as a normal, straight, like vertically looking down at a, like let's say you're thinking about New York City. If you were looking down at New York City, all the roads are parallel to each other. They're not in perspective. That's how this was created. It was put into a 3D rotation and laid down so that the back is smaller than the front. The front's bigger. That perspective was actually created using CSS, and the animation was created using CSS. And so they're just basically moving this back and forth within this 3-dimensional space to create this cool effect. Pretty awesome. We're actually going to learn how to do something kind of like this. We'll actually take a look at how that 3D rotation works in a little bit. For a totally different kind of thing, we wanted to choose some variety of things. Here, there's some interactions where if you click on something, something animates. So CSS can animate based on you clicking into something or tabbing into something. And then there's additional background animations of these things floating around. It's not a crazy complex animation. It's a subtle thing that just kind of catches your eye. CSS is fine for that. There's a question in the chat. Is the animated GIF just for the bubbles or the whole things with the photos? The animated GIFs was just the bubble area on the Spotify page. It was just, the photos would have been JPEGs, and just the animation area would have been the animated GIF. Now here, the CSS animations are actually like the opening. Let's hit refresh here. Watch how the laptop opens when it slides in and then it opens. So those actual like opening and sliding and that type of stuff, that's actually done using CSS. But this is like a story that's being told with specific timing. This is a video that's playing within the web page, by the way. But the animation of the laptop sliding in and then the laptop opening and then some of these other things happening after the video plays, they used a combination of JavaScript with CSS. So CSS is actually opening and closing the laptop, it's sliding in the laptop, but JavaScript is telling the timing of different events. So it's saying, hey, trigger the CSS animation to slide the laptop in. Then trigger the CSS animation to open the laptop. Then trigger the video to play. And then after the video is done playing, it says, oh, close the laptop, animate the text, open the laptop again. So CSS is technically being used to do the actual animations, but they're using JavaScript to do the timing of it because the timing is tricky with CSS. It's much easier to do complex timing with JavaScript. Now, while they were using JavaScript, I'm not sure why they didn't just use JavaScript for the animation while they were at it. Maybe they were doing it to try to optimize more because sometimes CSS animations can perform better if you're not careful. JavaScript animations, depending on how you do them, might not be as performant. There's libraries that we'll be talking about like Greensock, which take all of that out of the equation where you don't have to worry about whether you're using JavaScript to animate or CSS to animate. Greensock just takes care of all that, and if they need to offload to CSS to animate, they will. If they need to use JavaScript to do it, they will. They take that concern out of your mind. So here they had to actually use JavaScript and CSS to do this. Whereas if they would have just used something like Greensock, they could have done it all with JavaScript. And we'll be talking about Greensock in a little bit. Here's another page on that Stripe website. As I said, the Stripe website is awesome. It's a great website. And let's hit refresh here. Watch how these things animate in. This Amex Express logo does this cool like three-dimensional twist when it comes in. I'm just going to hit reload a couple times here. It does this cool twist, like a three-dimensional twist. I just love that little twist and bounce at the end. And then the rest of the things come in one at a time. The heading, the paragraph, the paragraph, the heading, the paragraph. If you watch this again, one after another, the staggered animation of one thing happens, the next thing, the next thing. So it's a sequential chain of one thing animating, and when that's done, the next thing happens, and then the next thing happens, and the next thing happens. And this was done using CSS as well. So pretty cool. We're actually going to learn how to do this using both CSS and JavaScript. I just took this example and said, hey, this is a pretty cool animation. Let's show people how to make this specific animation. So we'll be recreating this animation ourselves. And one last animation here for CSS. Now, actually, in here, I should mention that this particular animation, this is actually just a video playing. There's an example of CSS animation somewhere else on this page, but before I pass this over, this is just a video playing. Just because you can't tell that it's a video doesn't mean it's not a video. Like, don't always think of videos have a play button with a play bar and you can scrub back and forth and control audio, and that's a traditional video, but this is still using HTML video, HTML5 video to play a video. You just don't have controls for interacting with it. Now, if I right click on it, notice I can say open video in new tab. That's one of the things that indicates it. So they hid the controls by default. I can actually show the controls if I want to. And see there, you do actually have the controls, but they can hide them by default. So just don't always think that because you can't see controls that it's not a video. That's actually a video. And that video is probably created in something like After Effects for this cool video demonstration. Now, the CSS animation is Mr. Party Bird down here. Fun little party bird. Party! When you mouse over him, there's a little tooltip that says party. That is completely useless and just fun. Just a fun little thing there. If you're wondering, you're like, why did they put a party bird there? It actually comes from, if you look up party bird, there was a video of it. Party parrot, actually. Party Parrot, Cult of the Party Parrot. This is where it came from. It actually came from a YouTube video of a parrot doing this dance, and then people started turning them into animated GIFs, and so everybody was just creating their version of the Party Parrot, and most people were doing animated GIFs, and they thought, hey, let's create this as a CSS animation. This is our twist on the Party Parrot or the Party Bird, and so it's just some useless little fun, just a fun little thing, and I got a laugh out of it, so I thought, hey, this is a cool example of showing something crazy with CSS. Because you look at that color vibration that's going on there, rotating through all those colors. See, that's where animated GIF wouldn't work very well for this. The smooth playback of this, like the frame rate of this is really good. It's like nice, high quality, smooth animation, going crazy through the colors. All those color changes, that would have cranked up the file size of your animated GIF much higher. And so doing this through CSS kept the file size down dramatically and a really nice high quality frame rate to play back. So those are some examples of CSS. Now let's talk about JavaScript. Now JavaScript enables you to do a whole lot more and have a lot more control than the other techniques. I love this hat website. The design is super simple. Neat little things when you mouse over. You get this little lifting of the hat. I think that's kind of cool. So let's click on one of these hats. This is a high-end hat shop. And I love the way that these hats come in, the personality that they come in with. It mimics what was on the homepage of just kind of the back lifting up a little bit, and then it kind of comes down, but just gives these hats personality. Let's go back to the collection. Click on a different hat. And the interesting thing is, all the hats, they have the same animation. It's not like they changed it. And so essentially, this is just like an image slider that we've seen on billions of websites. But it's just the twist, the difference, the thing that makes it unique is that little bit of extra animation. And if you watch the shadow and how the shadow kind of changes and moves with the object, it just gives a little uniqueness and life to this that's not your typical page. And that's what I love about this, is they took a standard thing like a slider, gave it a twist to make it unique, and made this a unique website, something that I've not seen before. Thought that was cool. Then they have other information down below here, but it's mainly about, the hat and the quality and seeing what this thing is like. So that is done using JavaScript. Here they have a cool animation at the top for the logo. This is neat. Let's hit refresh again so you can see that again. So that's a fun little animation there. They also have some subtle animation as I'm going to scroll through this page. Watch how new content slides or maybe fades in. It's just going to do a little bit of a movement as I scroll. So as I scroll, see, like those things kind of slid in. It was very quick, very subtle, but it kind of drew your eye to it a little bit more. Let me hit refresh again. See how this content slid in? It kind of built 1, 2, 3, kind of slid a little bit. And so those things kind of fade in an order, slide in a little bit. Those things, when something happens upon entering your view. So as you're scrolling, if something says, oh, now I'm visible, let me animate for you, that is done using JavaScript. So JavaScript has to detect, hey, that thing is now visible, let me animate that for you. When you're using JavaScript, you can write plain JavaScript, but to animate things with plain JavaScript can be tedious. Greensock is a pre-written JavaScript library that you can use that its sole focus is doing great, high quality, high performance animation. And they make animating with JavaScript far, far easier than writing plain JavaScript. They've thought of all the things that you want to be able to do to animate and made it easier to do those things. For most people, it will be free. For some people, you might have to pay. The main thing about that is that if you are charging end users if you're charging end users to use your product, like for example, the New York Times has a paywall. If they used Greensock, then there's a membership that they can get with Greensock. It doesn't matter whether you make money on the project that you're doing. Like you can charge people to build a website and use Greensock for free as long as that website offers that content on the website for free. As long as they don't charge their end users, then Greensock is free to use. They do have some paid plugins that you can get in addition to the core, but the core of Greensock is free as long as you don't charge users to access your product. Completely changes the way that you create animation and it makes it so much easier. So it's a fantastic thing. And it's pretty much become a big standard within the industry, especially for ad banners. So let's show some examples. The Hunger Games website, they used it. I don't know all the parts in which they did use Greensock, but I know they used it at least in part for some of their website. It's not my screen going glitchy, that's the website. They have a neat animation here on the right-hand side. Slides off screen, you click on it to open it up. But notice how all those things come in. Watch that again. Watch how they slide in and how one comes in and then the next and then the next. And it's a sequence of this one animates first, this one animates second. And so they animate in all the same animation. They all slide in, but there's a little bit of an offset. There's a staggered amount from the first one to the second to the third. That staggering is so much easier to do with Greensock than any other like CSS, for example, or animated GIFs, because you could do that basically with like one line of code pretty much. And we're going to see actually how to do a staggered animation in a little bit. McDonald's had done this cool website. And this was actually back in 2013 that they had done this. It's no longer on the McDonald's website, but luckily it's still available online. It takes a while to load up because there's a bunch of stuff that they have in here, sounds and animations and everything. All right, so now we get to interact with it. So first of all, you can just drag around to view different parts. And notice as I drag, when I drag kind of quickly, notice that it kind of zooms out and then it zooms back in. So it kind of gives you like a little bit of a bird's eye view as you're moving, and then it kind of comes back a little bit closer. The speed and the rendering quality of this is just amazing. And you can click on any of these moments and you can interact. There's a little animation at each one. Get Fruit Ninja style with it. Do a little swipe on there, and then you'll see the animation. So it tells you click and swipe. So you swipe through the stuff. Just give a little swipe and then you see the animation. This tells you a little bit about it. And yeah, so each one of these is a different animation. Swipe it. Pretty cool stuff, but the performance of it is so nice and fast. Yeah, there's a comment in the chat that the site feels like Flash. So Greensock actually got its start in Flash. In Flash, you could animate with a timeline and you could animate with ActionScript. And so Greensock was an ActionScript library that you could use to animate. They made animating things with ActionScript easier. So Greensock has been around for a long time. They were in the days of Flash. That's how they got their start. But of course, they saw what was happening with Flash and they said, well, this is a great thing. It was great in Flash. Let's bring this natively to browsers with HTML5. And so they rewrote the whole library in JavaScript and brought the same concepts that we did action scripting in Flash, they brought it to the web, and they focused on high performance, high quality stuff. And so you can do amazing animated sites using Greensock, which is JavaScript. And it's like the old days of Flash in terms of what you can do. You can do amazingly crazy stuff, but it's coded animations, not a visible timeline. But the same thing was true in Flash. They did have a visible timeline, but the really cool, crazy stuff was really always done with code, with ActionScript. And that's what we do on the web. The really crazy, cool stuff is often done using code, using something like Greensock. The Now You See Me website, there was 2 versions of this movie. There was Now You See Me, and then Now You See Me 2, which was the sequel. And this is their movie website. Crazy animation website. I don't know how long this thing took to make or what the budget on it was, but they did some amazing stuff in here. As I mouse around, there's this kind of 3-dimensional rotation that you see going on here with the title. And then this is a scrolling website. So as I scroll through, if I scroll back and forth, you can see this stuff changing. Then they go through and they introduce each person, each actor in the movie. You can read more about it if you want to. I'm just going to scroll through them. So here's another actor. You just keep scrolling through. And just keep scrolling through. So then the actors and actresses are done. So here the rain's coming down, and then it stops, and then it starts to go back up. And then they trap the whole thing in a bubble, in a droplet, raindrop. That is cool. Keep scrolling. Now here, when you get here, if you start to mouse around, they have these crazy cool 3D floating effects. So we have another question in the chat. Is Greensock JavaScript? Yes, it is. Greensock is a JavaScript library. So there you go. So that's an awesome website there. So behind the scenes, when you're writing JavaScript, when you're writing Greensock code, first of all, Greensock is JavaScript, so you can write any normal JavaScript along with Greensock. But behind the scenes, Greensock is intelligent enough to use JavaScript to trigger CSS animations or JavaScript animations, whatever is the most performant way to do something. They take care of all that behind the scenes. So it might use CSS to animate something if that's going to perform better than JavaScript. So the nice thing is you just write one thing. You just write JavaScript, and it will use whatever is necessary to render that the best way possible. Now, let's refresh this one more time. Watch how the Rembrandt word comes in. I love the cool twist that does. Just neat stuff there. Also, the rollover that I do here when I mouse over that goes from a circle to a square. One of the great things about HTML5 is that they have a requirement for supporting SVG. SVG is scalable vector graphics. And that means that we have vector graphics natively on the web. So this is a circle that's being transformed into a square, and those are vector graphics. So it's doing a vector transformation. And Greensock actually has a plugin that you can get to do morphing of SVG. It's a paid plugin that you have to get, but you can morph between one SVG shape and another SVG shape. Same thing over here. Notice that's a circle. When I mouse over, it's a square. So you can morph SVG using JavaScript. Now I'm going to scroll down here. And see, there's all this sequence of chained events of something animating, then something else animating, something animating. And that sequence of events is very hard to do with CSS, much easier to do with JavaScript. So these cool things, if you click explore more. Now this is a video that's being played in that portion of it. But they have cool animations sliding between those. If I go over here to info, slides over, all sorts of neat stuff. Love that site. Definitely more stuff to see there if you want to explore it more. The French Bose site So this is Bose, but the French version of it has some pretty cool rollovers here. And when you're interacting with this, as I go in here and do these things, watch the building up of different elements. And that there's a sequence of the heading's going to come in, and then the paragraph is going to come in line by line. So watch for that. So as I scroll through here, notice how each element comes in one at a time. Like each line is coming in individually. Each element is coming in individually. So that sequential building, it walks you through the building of the thing, and it's just cool effect. And it catches your eye. Instead of the content just appearing, it builds in an interesting way. And they're not animating everything on the page, but they're animating the stuff that they want you to watch. That's the neat thing about it. Here's a web designer's portfolio site. Some neat sequential transformations there. Some more SVG changes there. I like the menu animation. It's very simple. Something coming in one after another. Watch how each of those things come in one after another. It's very quick. Home comes in, then portfolio, then about, and then contact. And that's really easy to do with something like Greensock because they have a staggered animation where you just say animate all those things with a little delay between them. And with like one line of code, you can create an animation like that. It's a good question about won't most of the stuff like rollovers get lost on tablets? So rollovers, a lot of people say rollovers don't work on tablets, and it's not exactly true that they don't work on tablets. They don't work as rollovers. Rollovers are typically turned into tap events on tablets and phones. So depending on how it works, the effect may or may not get lost. So if you have to hover over something to see something happen, on mobile it wouldn't work on hover, but a lot of times it turns into a tap. So if you tap, then you see that hover event. It's not done on hover, it's done on tap, but you still see it. For example, a menu that might appear on hover on a desktop, on mobile you could tap on it to open up the menu. So it may or may not get lost. You might still be able to see it, just the interaction changes from a hover interaction to a tap interaction, which does bring up the kind of idea of would people think to tap on something? And so you do want to keep that in mind when you're designing your animations and your web pages, that if you just say, oh, well, they'll just hover over it to see this information, well, on mobile, they're going to have to tap to see that, and would they think to tap that? And then if you have a hover that shows like a tooltip on desktop and they click to go to that page, on mobile, if they have to tap just to see the tooltip and then they have to tap again to actually go there, you know, that's really changing the interaction concept. And would they know to tap a second time to actually go to that page? So it's certainly something you have to keep in mind when you're doing these things. But I do believe in being able to do things for a specific platform. Just because mobile devices don't have a hover, that doesn't mean I'm never going to do a hover. But I will consider, do mobile users need that hover? How might it change? Yeah, so you have to keep it in mind. Now this is a neat loading animation of the page building in a really cool way. This user, who goes by the name of Nerdsmanship, does a lot of cool Greensock animations. This is a little something about him or her. I'm not sure who Nerdsmanship is, but let me just refresh this again just so you can see how this builds in. This artwork is from the Firefox website, and he or she, Nerdsmanship, animated it in. Now, you do want to think about, should you do an animation or not for a particular thing? He actually goes through and explains that in this particular case is actually a terrible user experience, because if you think about coming to this website, if this was actually the Firefox website, think of how long it takes you to see that download button. You have to wait through this whole animation to be able to finally see the download button. And if somebody's just coming to download Firefox, you might not want them to wait all that time to download Firefox. Just get them in, let them download it, and don't make a poor user experience to make people wait through animations. So blocking animations where an animation that blocks the user interaction is something where they have to wait for that animation to finish. Maybe if this download button would have always been there and the stuff would have been happening in the background, animating in the background, that wouldn't have been a blocking animation. It wouldn't have blocked the user from doing what they wanted to do. Maybe then that would have been fine. But by hiding this download button at the end, you got to consider that. Don't just have everything fade on and make people wait and, oh, wait, I'm waiting for this thing. Oh, how long is it going to be until I get there? Because maybe they don't even wait. Maybe they just scroll looking for something else on the page. So we want to use animation to enhance the user experience, to make it cool, to draw the reader's eye into certain areas. But you do want to consider user experience. Now, After Effects, you can make videos for web, for TV, for all sorts of things. I put a link here for web to Google's sizes for video ads. So here you can actually see how big you can make video ads for placement on Google. Videos, they can be on websites, they can be advertisements, they can be YouTube videos. So intros and outros are popular on YouTube, where when somebody starts up a video, there's some sort of intro animation, or at the end, there's an outro animation, just some cool finishing animation so people know it's starting and ending. Those are very popular. Those can be done in After Effects and then embedded into your YouTube video. You can turn After Effects videos into animated GIFs. We're going to show you how to do that today. And so you can use After Effects for animating lots of different things. It's not just a video animation tool. It is an animation tool that you can use with video and other things. So I'll show some examples. I am going to show some videos here. This is for Facebook.
How to say more with stickers. You can say things you can't say with words, like this.
This incorporates live action with the hands and also graphic elements that were animated in After Effects. So I chose this particularly because it was a combination of graphics and live motion. So don't think of After Effects as purely just animating video content. It can be animating all types of content, whether it's video or just graphics. South Park. I don't know if it's still being done with After Effects, but originally After Effects was being used to create the animations for South Park. So if you know South Park, the funny animated cartoon, that at least got its start with After Effects, and they still might be using After Effects to this day. I'm just not sure. So there's this T-Mobile ad.
Business doesn't stop at the border. That's why we're giving you coverage in 3 countries for the price of 1. That's right. Get 4G LTE data in Mexico
Notice
and Canada.
in some of these screens, watch the background, how the backgrounds are moving.
To and from all 3 countries.
And so there's like here, that background is like pulsating. There's all these little subtle animations
is how easy
within
they make it to do business
the whole
in Mexico and Canada.
Video
Switch
ad.
your business to T-Mobile today.
So we actually, in our After Effects Level 2 class, we actually show you how to create some of that. Let's go to here. See that pulsing background? Show you how to create those and the moving stripes in the backgrounds. We shot our own actor here for this, so it wasn't the T-Mobile people. We show you how to create some of those elements from that T-Mobile commercial. We show you how to create that in our After Effects After Effects Level 2 class. All right, so those are the different types. Those are examples of them. Soon I'm going to be getting started actually showing you how to create all these different things. But before I do that, one thing that's common to many types of animation is something called easing. And the idea of easing is that in real life, when you're pushing a ball or something, an object doesn't physically instantly start and instantly stop at full speed. It starts going slower and it might accelerate. And if it's going to stop, it typically slowly maybe slowly comes to a stop. Like a car, it accelerates and gets up to speed, and then when you go to stop, you can't just stop instantly. You have to slow down and eventually stop. So if in real life things slowly start up and slowly end, a lot of times changing the rate of speed is good for your online animations as well. So linear speed, where it just starts instantly and stops instantly, might look a little unnatural. So that's what we call a linear speed. Easing changes the rate of speed, so it goes slower or faster at different parts of the animation, typically at the beginning or the end. So you're changing your rate of speed, and that makes it more like real life. Just makes it look more natural, but you can also use it for different creative effects. I'll show you some examples of tools that you can use for easing. Greensock, for example, has the most flexibility when it comes to easing. They have this really cool visualizer. If you hit run here, what's going on here that I can't hit the run? See, normally you can hit that run button. I'm not sure why I can't hit that run button. To tell them about that, seems like they have a little glitch on here. Well, I can still switch here and you can still see this. Should be able to just hit run. Yeah, it seems like they must have just recently made a change. You know what? Let me just try this in Safari. See if this works here in Safari. No, it doesn't work in Safari either. Okay, all right. Well, I can still do this. You could just click on the name here to run it. This is a linear speed. Watch the ball as it moves. It starts and it stops, and there's no slowing down at the beginning or the end. Notice that this one slows. So because we have an ease in, which is the start, we could switch it to an ease out, but because we have an ease in, it starts at the start of it. It goes slowly there, and then it ends a bit fast. If we switch this to ease out, it goes faster at the beginning because it's going to slow at the end. Power 2 just accentuates that. Power 3 just accentuates that. Power 4 just accentuates that. So it's a more accentuated, starts really fast and then really slows down at the end. Now a back actually overshoots a little bit and then comes back. So it goes beyond its target and then comes back. Or a bounce, an elastic. Elastic is like a back, but it has this like little kind of elasticity that it goes boing, 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 boing. You got to make your own sound effects here. Boing, 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 boing. Elastic overshoots, whereas bounce doesn't. Bounce goes to the target, but then it literally looks like a bouncing ball. That's pretty cool. So you could do all sorts of ones. Like this is where you get into creative effects. If you're changing the rate of speed with rough, you're having something move kind of crazy, and that could be interesting. Moving something in certain cases. What's really cool is you can actually create your own custom one with Greensock. So you could choose any one of these, go to custom, and actually change and do your own easing, which is cool. And then they give you the code that you need to use in your Greensock code. Awesome. So Greensock has the most flexible easing out of all of them. Let's look at some other easing types. So this website, Caesar, is actually created by Matthew Leon, who used to teach at Noble Desktop before he moved away from New York City. And he called it Caesar because it's CSS easing, CSS easer, Caesar, right? So that's the play on words that he did. And here you have a menu which you choose from. You've got ease ins, you've got ease outs, and ease in and out would be start and end. So ins are the start, outs are the ends, and in and out is start and end. And these are pretty standard equations that a lot of animation tools use, but you don't have to worry about the name. Just choose one of them, see how it looks, and you can see the greater the change in the curve, the more accentuated that easing is going to be. If you click left, you can see it move. This is going to be more accentuated, so it's here you really see it. Let's do it on the in, yes. So it's going to start slowly and then go fast. So it starts slowly and then goes fast. And if you do one of the ones that's a less of a curve, you're not going to see as much of a rate of change. It's much more linear. right? This one's literally linear, doesn't change. It doesn't go slower at the beginning or the end. So these are all for CSS, and he actually does let you customize this. This is customizable. You can do custom ones here, and then they give you all the code that you need for that, which is awesome. But that's just for CSS. Now, let's say you're doing, this tool is kind of neat because of the visualizations. Notice it's the same names that he was using, but there are a couple extra ones here, for example, like the elastic that Matt doesn't have on his site. And that's because this website does CSS and JavaScript, whereas Matt's was just CSS. So here they give you the CSS. And they also give you, if you're doing jQuery, which is a popular library, they give you it in jQuery for doing that easy. And because of that, some of these, like Elastic, that's not supported in CSS, but it is supported in jQuery. So the thing that this website doesn't do is it doesn't give you a custom option, which Matt's website does. So if you want to do a custom CSS, then you use Matt's website. All right, so enough about that. Now it's time to show you how to create this kind of stuff. We're going to create a simple animated GIF. We're going to create some CSS animations. We're going to create some JavaScript animations. And finally, we're going to end on After Effects and Photoshop doing that. All the files that I'm demonstrating with, there's a link to them in the very beginning of this slide deck. And there's also actually a written exercise for doing the After Effects and Photoshop part, because that was just, there was so many steps involved in that we wanted to write actually a written exercise for that. I'm going to show you first the simple animated GIF in Photoshop, and then we'll take a short break so you can use the restroom or go grab a drink. But let's do a simple animated GIF to start. So I want to show you something to get started here. So these are the files that I downloaded. The link to this is in the beginning of those presentation slides. And I numbered these in order that we're going to do them. First, we're going to do animated GIF in Photoshop. I'm going to there is a done file if you want to see it. There's the finished animated GIF, but I'm going to open up the starter file in Photoshop. So you can animate in Photoshop. Oh, if you see this dialog, just cancel it. We don't want to add this stuff into the Creative Cloud library. No, I like to not show this again because I never want to do this when I open up files. So cancel that. All right. This was for an email that we were sending out telling people that you can learn in New York City or take our classes online. So we wanted to tell people that in an email, and this was the animation that we wanted to include in that email. The idea being that first they'd see the text learn in New York City, then they'd see or anywhere online, and then we'd start having logos appearing all around the world. So that was the concept. Now, how did we get this done, and why did we set up our file in this way? One thing you have to know about animating things in Photoshop when you're creating animated GIF is that if you want to hide something and show something else, you want them to be different layers. While you could change the type, in theory, on one layer, whenever you change the type, that changes throughout all the frames of your animation everywhere in Photoshop. So if I change this type from Learn in NYC to or anywhere online, it doesn't matter where that type is in my animation, it changes everywhere. So if you want to change from one piece of type to another, you have to have two different layers, and you're going to hide one of them and show the one you want to see. And then on the next frame, you're going to hide the old one and show the new one. So you need to make different layers. For the logos, there were a bunch of different logos. And initially, I just had them all out here, but it was kind of hard to envision how was this going to start to pop in the new logos. So what I started to do was create these different folders. In there, you can see all the different logos. So all these logos initially were out of the folders, and I just started popping them into folders so that I could kind of group which ones I wanted to appear in what order. So I wanted these to appear first and those to appear second. And if it didn't quite look right, I would just go into the one folder and just drag it from one folder to the next until I figured out what I thought was a good popping in of the different logos. So that just took a little bit of experimenting with. And then this is the first logo right there and the background. Notice the background is solid flat color for the most part. It's not a gradation. That helped to keep our file size small. Now to actually animate this, we need to open up our timeline in Photoshop. So I open up my timeline panel. There are two different timelines you can create: a video timeline, which is more like After Effects, or a frame animation. We're going to create a simpler frame animation. Both of them are good and they have their pros and cons. The video timeline lets you do more complex animations, kind of like After Effects. It's going to be more like an After Effects timeline when we learn After Effects. But the frame animation, this is more like a flipbook style animation. When you were young, if you ever took a pad of paper, and on the first page, you drew a circle at the bottom, and then you flipped the page and you went, and on the next page, you drew it up a little bit higher, and you drew it up a little bit higher on the next page. And then when it got to the peak, then you started moving it down from page to page. And when you flipped through, it looked like the ball was moving up and down and bouncing. If you ever did that flipbook style of animation, that's kind of the way that animated GIFs work with a frame animation. Just you see one frame, then you see another, and then you see another. So it's kind of like picture, 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 picture. That's each of your frames. That's the one we're going to create now, just to keep it simple. So I click this button to actually create the frame animation. We have the first frame here looking like this. I'm going to create a new frame by clicking the New Frame button. Now we have two frames that look exactly identical. What I do on the second frame is only going to happen on the second frame when it comes to hiding and showing layers. If I hide that layer and show this layer, that only happened on frame 2. So I can go back to frame 1, which is still showing the original set of layers. So the layers exist on all frames, but you don't have to see all the layers. You can hide the ones you don't want to see. So I create another frame, and then I can show some additional logos. I create another frame, show some more logos. I can create another frame and show some more logos. Now we can play this back. I can hit the play button, and wow, that was really fast. First of all, it's only looping once. Let's have this thing loop forever, so it keeps looping. But boy, you better be able to read fast, because there is no time delay on this right now. Notice these 0 seconds. It shows that picture. It doesn't wait at all. It just goes right to the next picture and right to the next picture. As fast as that can flip through them, it flips through them as fast as possible. You're going to want to put some delays. You're going to want to wait on a picture for a certain amount of time. Maybe on this first frame, I could wait a second for people to be able to read that text. Then when they get to the second frame, maybe they wait another second on that text. Then these logo animations, they can pop in pretty quickly, maybe all at the same time, a time delay, I should say. Not the same time, but the same time delay. So I'm going to click on one frame, shift click on another so that they're all selected, and then I can change all of their delays to maybe 0.2 seconds. So it waits just a little bit of time between them. Let's go back now to the first frame and hit play. So we see that for a second. Now we see that for a second. And oh, maybe a second isn't quite enough. And also when it gets to the very end, it rewinds back to the beginning because we're only waiting on that frame for 0.2 seconds. We probably want to sit there for maybe like a whole 2 seconds. And maybe even this. Maybe I want to do 1.5 seconds. So I can go to other and type in my own command here, like 1.5 seconds. So let's see there. Learn in NYC or anywhere online, and then the logos pop in. So you can play around with the timing. Timing does not increase your file size at all. So if you want this to sit there for 2 seconds, that does not increase your file size. So don't think that longer times increase file size. They don't at all. It's just a delay, just a number. And then when you're done, you can go to export, save for web. Now you have to do the old legacy save for web because the newer export does not support animated GIFs. You have to do the save for web legacy. In here you can choose GIF. You can hit the play button to play it back. Zoom in there so you guys can see that a bit better. So you can see it once again here. Now why might you want to see the animation here? In fact, they actually have stepper buttons here, which you can step through the frames of your animation. You want to see that here because you're choosing how many colors are going to be included in the GIF. If you don't include enough colors, your image might not look very good. If I go down here to say 4 colors, oh, my logo's disappeared because it didn't have enough colors to reproduce them. That's not very good. So you need to choose enough colors to represent your graphic. The goal here, though, is to try to get the number of colors as low as possible because if you go with more colors, you're going to have a bigger file size, 23.7K. Let's see if we can get that smaller. I didn't see any difference between 128 colors and 256, but it does bump from 23.7K down to 22.9. Let's see if we can go lower. Yeah, actually 64 still looks good. Now we're down to 20K. So you just keep going down, seeing how low you can get. Now there I started to see a little bit more change. Maybe I want to go somewhere in between, like maybe like 45. From original to now, that's pretty good. We got it down to 18K, so we saved some file size on that. And let's hit save. Go to my desktop. I'll call it finished.gif. I do always open these up in a browser because different browsers can sometimes render the speed a little bit differently. So I like to have a browser window open, and you just drag and drop that onto your browser window, and then you can see it here in the browser. And it's possible speeds might vary a little bit between Safari and Chrome, maybe a little bit, but always judge your final speed in the browser, not in Photoshop. So if it's a little bit different here, go back to Photoshop, tweak it, make it a little shorter, a little bit longer, and you'll get it good. All right, so that is animated GIFs. Let's take a 5-minute break. If you're watching this live, go grab a drink, use the restroom. In 5 minutes, we'll continue. Okie dokie. We are back. Hopefully you had a good break, or if you're watching this as a recording, you probably just maybe fast forwarded. Okay, so that's enough for animated GIFs. Lots more we could do with animated GIFs, but that's all we have time for today. Next up in our stuff is CSS animation and JavaScript animation. Now we're actually going to do a JavaScript animation first. We're going to do a Greensock animation. Let me show you what we're going to do. Actually, let's go back to my presentation. Actually, I have two of these open. Let me show you the website that we're going to recreate the Nintendo Switch animation. So this animation right there, that like clicking that they do. So the whole idea of this is that the Nintendo Switch has two pieces that kind of click together. So that's why their logo animates that way. All right, so that little moving down on the right-hand side, we're going to make that animation. Let me just show you how they animated it, just in case you're curious. They did it in a way that surprised me, to say the least. Not how I would have created it, and I have an idea of why I think they might have done it this way, but I was very surprised to see this because I would normally not create an animation this way. They made a PNG file. The PNG file had a transparent background, so to see it, I just threw a black background here just so you can see it. Now, they include the word Nintendo, but for some reason did not include Switch. I'm not really sure why they included Nintendo, because I don't believe they ever animate Nintendo. Also, they didn't need to include the space for down below here, but regardless of that, what they essentially do is they take a slice of this and they show that, and they crop all the rest out. So they're moving within this space, they're moving this PNG graphic, and then they're going to move it over and they're going to show you this part of the PNG. So they're cropping out using code, they're cropping out parts of it so you only see like one frame. So this is like all the frames put into a single PNG. And if you notice, for a while nothing happens because this thing starts at the top right, but then nothing happens for quite a while until it then moves up just a little teeny bit. See, there it starts a little bit lower and it kind of pulls up before it starts to come down. So there, it comes up and then now it's starting to come down. And now it's doing the click. Okay, and then notice when it hits the bottom, it actually moves down and then kind of bounces back up. So it clicks and kind of hits down. So now when you watch this animation, this goes up just a teeny little bit and then boom, slides down. That was a sprited animation. That thing is called a sprite. They're showing you one piece of the sprite and there's a consistent frame rate that they used. Like, so every few milliseconds or something, they switch to the next frame. So they're showing probably something like 30 frames per second. And so every 30th of a second, they advance to the next portion of the sprite, the next portion, the next portion. I would not have built it this way. There's a much easier way to do it. I was thinking to myself, why did they do it this way? And the only thing I can think of is that maybe this was originally created as an animation in After Effects. And you know, this is Nintendo, so they're going to have it. It's for TV, right? It's for screens. So that maybe they have the same animation in their operating system, in their video ads for TV, for web. And so if they had originally created this as an After Effects animation, maybe they wanted to not ever recreate it in some other medium. I still think for users to download, it would have been better if they had recreated it as a native web animation, like the way I'm going to show you how to create it. It would have been better for users because it would have downloaded faster. But I think maybe for consistency's sake, that's probably why they did it. And when I thought of all the reasons why they might have done it, that's the only one that made sense. And I think it does make sense in their standpoint of, hey, let's do this animation once. We'll always use it in exactly the same way. We built it in After Effects, which can export a sprite of this, and we'll just animate it on the web using a sprite. If they had only done this on the web, I do not think they would have used this technique, but I think they started with it as a video thing first and then kind of made it work on the web. I'm not going to show you how to do it this way. I'm going to show you how to do it as, what if you were doing a native web animation? How would you build this yourself? using something like Greensock. So the first thing you would do is you would want an SVG version of the logo. That was a pixel-based version. So I went out and grabbed a vector version of the logo. I found one online. And whether you're using something like Adobe Illustrator or Sketch, which is a Mac web design app, doesn't really matter what you're using to export your SVG graphic. Here is the white version of the Sketch logo. I didn't want to include it on white, so I put it on a gray background just so you could see, but I didn't export the gray as part of it. I just exported just the white logo. SVG files, the scalable vector graphic files, they have transparent backgrounds. So if you don't include a background, you're going to see through to whatever you have on the page. The main thing about setting up an SVG file in your vector program like Illustrator or Sketch or Adobe Experience Design, whatever it is, the important thing is that you name your sections that you're going to animate. That way you can call them by name to say, let me animate the left side or the right side or the text. And in this case, by grouping the left side, the right side, and the text together and giving it a name, when we make this exportable in Sketch, it will transfer those names into code. Illustrator does the same thing. If you name groups in your layers panel in Illustrator, it will also export those names into your SVG code as well. And in Illustrator, you would do a file export as, and when you file export as an SVG, then you'll get the SVG file from there. In Sketch, you come down here and click the little plus button and export as SVG this way. All right, and then you just hit export and you get your file. All right, so let's see what that SVG looks like. If I want to see this as code, because it is actually a coded file, I can open this up in a code editor. Now you could use Sublime Text, which is my favorite. You can use something like Atom or Dreamweaver or whatever different code editor you want. It doesn't really matter as far as doing some simple stuff. Definitely my personal preference is Sublime Text or Atom. Those would be my two choices for my first ones, but you can use other ones. Notice that they have created groups for the different sections. So here we have the Switch logo, and in there is a left side path, a right side path, and a text path. Those are the three names that I gave my SVG in Sketch or in Illustrator or whatever it is. That name is very important. It's an ID. There's only one thing called left side, right side, or text. And that's important, is that you have to use unique IDs. Never reuse a name. It has to be one name per graphic and never reuse that name anywhere else in that graphic. Don't worry about all the coordinates and all that stuff. That's just where all the points go. You don't have to really understand this other than you want to know the names that you gave it and that name made its way into the SVG file. That's really important. I then took that SVG code and I put it into an HTML file. So let me just open up that HTML file so you can see what it looks like. I put a gray background on the page and I put my SVG file in there. Let's see how I did that. I'm going to open up that in my code editor here. I copied and pasted the code from the SVG file. I pasted it right here inside of my document. It's important to paste the SVG code into your document as opposed to linking to it like an image. A lot of times in HTML, you put an image tag and you link out to an SVG, but you want to embed the SVG code because we want to animate parts of it. If I just want to animate the whole image and just move an image around, you could use an image tag. But because I want to animate parts of the SVG, the whole SVG code must be embedded directly into this page. All right, so I have the left side, I have the right side. Those are the two sides I'm going to be changing. I don't care about the text, just left side and right side. It's important for us to remember those two names. Now that I have that page made, I want to animate it. Now, one problem is that in the Nintendo Switch website, this right side started up. So I'm going to initially need to move that up a little bit to start, and then I don't want it to animate up. I just want it to just jump right up to the top, and then I want it to animate down. So I will have to change that. Let's see how to start animating with Greensock. Now, I've already included a link to Greensock, but how do I get that? Well, you just go to greensock.com. Now, remember, Greensock is a JavaScript library. even if you don't know JavaScript, just follow along and see how much you can understand. But ideally, to do coded animations, you would know how CSS, HTML, and JavaScript work. But even if you don't know those, just follow along and see how much you learn. You click download GSAP, and they're going to give you a link that will pull it off of their content delivery network. The more people use this, the more it's shared around the web. It might be in your browser's cache, and it might download faster. You can download it yourself and load it off of your own server if you want to, but it's typically going to be faster to be loaded off of their content delivery network. So you just copy that and paste it into your page. So that's what I did. I just copied and pasted that. This loads the Greensock JavaScript library, and now we can use Greensock features in my page. Now remember, Greensock is JavaScript. So we're going to write JavaScript. We can write any normal JavaScript, but Greensock provides certain features, certain functions, methods to call. So there's lots of information on their website. We have a course in Greensock if you want to check it out more, but I'm going to give you kind of a crash course right now. One of the cool features is a thing called a timeline in Greensock. And what I'm doing here, all this code right here in this script tag it's been commented out so it doesn't work. Just so I don't have to write all the code in front of you, which would take longer, I'm going to uncomment the code. By commenting it, by putting that // it means don't execute that code. So notice how it grays it out. When there's a // that code doesn't work. When I delete that // that uncomments the code, and now that code will actually be executed by the browser. I'm going to quickly do that by hitting a keystroke to toggle the comment, which is Command/ on the Mac, or on Windows Control/. That will just turn the comment on or off, so I can do that a little bit more quickly. So this new timeline max is a feature of Greensock. That's actually what we loaded. Tween max loads tween max and timeline max. The tweening part is to animate, to go between one thing and another. The timeline part lets us chain a sequence of events, and that's the key that Greensock makes easier, is do something else, one after each other. The reason we're creating a timeline is so that we can create this series of events. I'm just going to call the timeline just timeline. You can call it whatever you want. I just made up the name timeline, and that's going to create a new timeline within Greensock. Next, we can tell that timeline to do things. Anything we put into the timeline is going to happen in the sequence that we put it in. Whatever you put in first happens first. Whatever you put in second will happen second. Normally, you're going to animate something, but as I mentioned, the right-hand side of this needs to immediately move up without animating. And so instead of going to that place with a time, I'm just going to set the right-hand side to a position, and using set will just instantly set it. It won't animate from one position to another. Notice that this is the name of my element. You have to use a hashtag because in web page, when you're coding, hashtag means an ID. If you were using a class, you would use a period, but we're using IDs, so we use the hashtag. So this is the target, the thing that you want to change, and then comma, in these curly braces, what do you want to do? There's lots of things you can do with Greensock. X and Y position, we're just going to move this vertically up minus 70 pixels. I just played around with it to see what looks good and ended up choosing 70. I thought that looked good. So I'm going to save that, come back, and hit refresh. Now that moved it up 70 pixels, except the SVG file is this size, and we just moved it out of the SVG file. Oops. It's kind of like being cropped off of the image. So it's there, it's just out of view, and we need to fix that. So we can come up here. The SVG file that I put into the document, if I put some padding inside of that, I'm going to uncomment out this CSS. I can put some extra padding inside. Padding is inside of an element. That's going to create space within the element that I can move things around. I don't need any horizontal, but I do need some vertical padding. This is 80 pixels, because remember I moved it up 70 pixels, but our animation is going to pull up a little bit before slamming down. So I gave it an extra 10 pixels that we can pull up before slamming down. Otherwise, if we weren't pulling up before we slam down, then I would have just done 70. Firefox needs this overflow to be visible because it hides the overflow by default. So that's just something that Firefox needs. Okay, so now we can see that additional overflow. Okay. Now we can animate. So notice that set, when I hit reload here, set just immediately goes there. There's no animation or anything. From this point, we now want to slam this down. Everything starts initially where you had it. So that's why I had to go -70 to move it up from its current position. Now when you want to animate something, again, into this timeline, we're going to add a second thing. But this time we're going to use a to animation. We're going to animate from the current position to a different position. We're still animating the right-hand side, but this time, since it's an animation, we have to tell it how long to animate. 0.3 seconds is enough. We don't need to wait a long time. This doesn't need to be 10 seconds. Just slam that thing down, and we're going to go back to a y of 0, which was its original position. So initially we moved it up 70. We're going back down to where it used to be, which was a y of 0. Let's take this off for just a second, and I'll explain that in just a moment. So what are you animating? How long are you animating it? And what are you actually animating? The position. All right, cool. So I'm just hitting the keystroke to reload this page, and I'll just keep hitting it again so you see. Now, there's no delay. I don't really get to see it sitting up there before it comes down. And on the Nintendo Switch website, if we watch that, it sits there for a little while before it slams down. So let's go back. I need to give it a little bit of a delay. And that's the fourth parameter. So the first one is, what are you going to animate? Secondly, how long are you going to animate it? And thirdly, what are you going to animate? Well, after that, you can put an optional fourth parameter, which is called a position parameter. The plus equals means to add. If you don't use plus equals, that is an offset from the beginning, and actually then you don't need the quotes. That is an offset from the very beginning of the timeline. When you're putting this in quotes as plus equals, it says, relative to the thing that just animated, add 0.7 seconds. So there could have been 5 things animating prior to this, but this 0.7 seconds is going to be 0.7 seconds after this thing finished. So that's going to wait 0.7 seconds before this animation starts. Okay. Oh, sorry. That's the Nintendo Switch website. So it waits, so I'm going to hit reload, waits 0.7 seconds, and then animates down. Now, once it animates down, to get that hit kind of feeling, now both of these should move down a little bit. And it moves down, and then it moves back up. But both sides are moving. So let's go next. The right and the left side. So you can put a comma, so you can animate multiple things at the same time. Both sides should take 0.07 seconds, so a very short amount of time, to move down. We started negative, moving up. Now we went back to 0 to move back to its original position, and now we're moving just a little bit down. Let's see that. Boom. Of course, we move down. Now we need to move back up to the 0 position. So that's the final thing. Animate both sides the same amount of time back up to 0. So the 2 of Greensock animates from wherever it currently is to the final destination that you're giving it. And it could be position, it could be opacity, it could be anything you want. There's lots of different parameters you can put in here. In this case, it happens to be position. So I'm going to hit refresh. Ba-doom. Look at that. Ba-doom. That's pretty cool. So in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 essential lines of code, we have animated this. And Greensock to load is only about 36K. And just to put that in perspective, if Greensock is about 36K, their PNG that they loaded on the Nintendo website was 185K. Loading Greensock and animating it are way smaller than their PNG. So it's going to load a lot faster, and it's going to be smoother. Now, if you want to make this even a little bit better, you can go to the easing visualizer here, figure out what kind of easing you want, and then you can grab this easing code once you figure out Y is what is actually animating, this is the easing itself right here. Notice you just put commas between these different parameters there. Figure out which one you want. And for example, I liked the ease in the back version of it. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to cut that there. I'm going to add it right in here. So that's one of these parameters that's here in these curly braces. So it's going to animate when it's slamming down. It's going to go from the -70 down to 0. So this kind of backs it up. This goes down. While it's moving down, I'm going to do a back ease. Back means it backs up a little bit before going into that ease. So let's save that, come back to my page. And so when I do this, it's going to back up a little bit before slamming down. Watch that again. See, it goes up a little teeny bit before going in. So it backs up first before slamming down. And that gives it just a nicer hit like that. Cool. All right. So that was kind of a crash course in how Greensock works, just so you get a taste of how that works. I know that was quick. There's a lot more we can go into it, but it gives you kind of a taste. And we've got some more animations that we want to create now. All right. Let's go back. Now, let's talk about CSS animation. Oh, if you want a CSS animated version of that, if you were curious, you could check out, this was somebody that did the same thing in CSS. But just to kind of give you an idea, they wrote a lot more lines of code. So they had to write all of this stuff to animate that. So what I did in like 5 lines of code, they did in this. Now, granted, they don't have to download Greensock. So overall, this whole page would load faster. But the actual writing of the animation code is easier to do in Greensock. Overall, you know, if you're loading Greensock to do a lot of animation, it's totally worth doing animation with Greensock. It's worth loading that library. It's not a huge library. It does add a little bit of weight, but not very much. If you're only doing one teeny little thing like this, then CSS animation, if you can do it with CSS, you don't have to load Greensock. But overall, the more animation you do, the more you want to load Greensock, because it just makes everything so much easier. As you're going to see, I am going to show you how to recreate this animation, the logo and these paragraphs fading in. Not the background, that's too much for today. We don't have enough time for that. All right, so let's see how to do this. We're getting low on time here, so we got to get cranking here. I included a version as they built it. I'm not going to build it the way they did because it was built a while ago, and if they built it today, they wouldn't have built it the way they did years ago. I'm going to show you the way that they probably would build it today. I'm going to show you how to build it with both CSS and Greensock to compare. So let's check it out. Before I show you how to do this, oh, there's a good question in the chat. Would CSS use the vectors from SVG? Yeah, CSS and Greensock can animate any elements. So yeah, you can do it with SVG. It would be using the vectors of those as well. Sure. Because this animation is going to do a little bit of 3D rotation, I just wanted to explain the concept of 3D rotation. Try not to let this confuse the concept of the animation. You can animate anything you want. This is just one example of a thing that you can animate. So how do we transform this into a 3D transformed box? There's a little CSS code that you can add. It's transform, there's rotate X and rotate Y. Now, the reason that this works is because on the parent container, the wrapper, we have set a perspective amount. If you don't have a perspective amount, it's not going to work. So this is a 2-step process to get the perspective to work. You have to set a perspective amount on a parent container that contains your content. And the greater the amount, this is like a distance to the object. So if you say a distance of 100, you're right up against that thing, and so there's a really extreme perspective. If you say 1,000, you're really far away from the object, and you don't see much perspective. The greater the number, the less perspective you see. So you want to choose smaller numbers to see greater perspective amounts. Once you have a perspective amount, then on a child element, you can go in and set something like a rotate X, and this will rotate along the X axis. Here I'm just using my Option arrow keys to rotate this. If I add the Shift key, it goes faster. So it's doing a 3-dimensional rotation along that x-axis. You could also do it with a y-axis if you wanted to, so you're rotating on a different axis. And yes, you can also rotate along both axes at the same time. So here you're doing the x-axis rotation as well as the y, and you just put both of them in with a space in between. So cool. That has nothing to necessarily do with animation. That's just a cool thing that you can do in CSS, but we're going to happen to animate that thing. You can animate anything you want. We're just going to happen to animate this because the example web page chose to animate that, the Stripe website. So let's look at the starter file that we have here. And what I initially did was I wanted to figure out like what looks like a good starting transformation. So they tweaked this. This is how they started out. This was actually like a starting 3D rotation, and then they rotated back to normal. So this is where they start from, and then they go back to normal. All this text started down below and then animated up. So this was kind of rotated and comes back to normal. This was moved down and again comes back to normal. So we go back to normal position. So in this starter file, let me drag this onto Sublime Text so we can open up this. The CSS is really what we're concerned with here, the animation CSS. But it's going to refer to our HTML with the class names that we came up with. So we do have to look at this just a little bit. And this was the code that they wrote. I didn't go in and really change the code that they wrote. So let's see. So here's the logo. That's the logo that was 3-dimensionally twisted. Then those paragraphs and headings, those were all given a class of animate in. So anything we want to slide in like sequentially was called animate in. But because there was going to be a little bit of a delay between them, they also added another name called delay 1, delay 2, delay 3. Now these are just names, and to make them actually work, we're going to have to use those names to apply CSS. So these are the names we're going to be using in our CSS. So I told the logo and I told the animate in, I wanted to figure out what's the good starting point just to see on the page. So I did a little bit of scaling. I made it smaller. I did the 3D rotation on the X and the Y axis. That is how I got, let's open this up in, sorry, not that. Let me open this up in my browser. That's how I got this rotation. To push this down, I experimented with that as well. And that just had to be moved. Translate Y moves down. And also it was scaled a little bit because that's what they did in their example. They scaled it a little bit as well. So it actually grows up and moves up as well. So ultimately in our page, we don't need those. I'm going to comment those out because this is how the page normally looks. But I wanted to see what it looks like with those transformations. It's going to end up looking like this. So how do we animate from some other thing to this current appearance? What you do is you have to define keyframes. Now I'm going to uncomment out this code. You have to say, I'm going to define keyframes. This is defining an animation. You come up with a name, whatever name you want, and you say, I want to call this animate logo. At the beginning, 0% of the time to 100% of the time. Notice you're not actually putting in a time value yet. You're just putting in a percentage. We want to animate from 0 opacity to 100% from the beginning to the end. We also want to animate from that transformation that I figured out, that 3D rotated state, back to no transformation, which is the current appearance. So start being transformed and end with no transformation. Sandy asked, it looks like there's no on-screen controls for transformations, just modifying code. The browser inspectors sometimes give you ways to interact with the code. Safari does also give kind of a visual builder, but when you're doing coded animations like this, the primary interaction is coding it. And then if you want to see some of the stuff, you can play with it like I was playing it with it in the inspector, in the browser. Yes. So yeah, you're coding these things. And it might seem foreign at first, but once you get into code and you start to work with it, these things eventually just become second nature as long as you're using them and interacting with them enough. You just start to be able to do it, and it's initially they might be unintuitive, but once you get into it, it eventually just becomes second nature. Now, this just defines an animation, but it doesn't apply it to anything. So if I reload the page, nothing happens. I actually have to say, hey, tell the logo to use that animation that I just created. So you say, I made an animation, specifically this animation that I called animate logo, and this is where the time comes in. I say, take 0.7 seconds to do that. So from 0 to 100%, that will span 0.7 seconds. Or it could be 7 seconds, just depends on how long you want it to happen. Look at that. So 0%, it starts with the 3D rotation. 100%, it ends with no transformation. So again, if you want to build an animation, the first step is to create a named animation. Notice I chose a different name for this. Instead of animate logo, this is called slide in. You can do different keyframes if you want. You could have one at 20% and change some value. You could have another one at 50% and change some value. You can have as many keyframes as you want. These are places at which you want to change a CSS value. Any CSS, well, I shouldn't say any animatable CSS value. A lot of things can be animated, but it might be that there are some things you can't. We want to go from an opacity of 0 to an opacity of 1. So from 0 to 100% opacity. From this transformation, which moves it down and scales it down, to no transformation. So it's going to start down and small and then end up being the normal size. Don't forget that once you define the animation, you have to apply it to something in your page. I have a lot of things called animate in, so a lot of things are now going to animate in using this animation. And I told this one to take a little longer, 0.8 seconds. Let's reload the page. See, now all of these things are animating in. Cool. But I want them to animate it in sequence. That's where this gets a little annoying with CSS, because you have to add a name to each one of those elements and then individually choose a delay amount. So you say, hey, delay that animation 0.1 seconds, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, 0.5. And if you have a lot of them, this gets pretty tedious. It's kind of annoying. But that's the way that you do it in CSS. And then, now the only thing is, this is not exactly what I was imagining. Notice how everything is there visible and then it disappears and like reappears. So we got to think about, to understand this, you have to think about what this animation does. So this animation says that when the animation starts, it will make it disappear and then reappear. But if the animation is delayed, how do these things look normally? Let me hide that animation. Remember that the page, this stuff is there by default. So if you wait to animate this, which remember that will hide it and then make it reappear, it's going to be visible to start and then it will hide it and make it reappear. That's not what I want. So there's a special thing called this fill mode. And if you think about the animation delay, as it pushes the animation time-wise away from the start of the load of the page. So the page loads, and then like a half second later, the animation kicks in. Well, what happens before that animation starts? This fill mode fills in going backwards, which means before the animation start, and it fills in and it says, hey, how do you want that animation to start? Oh, you want it to start at 0 opacity? I will fill that in back to the start of the page load. So it kind of fills in the gap until the animation starts. Now it's a little weird of a name there, but it kind of fills in until the animation starts. And that's the way that I wanted it, because I wanted all those things to start being hidden. So it took this attribute and said, hey, just do that attribute from the very beginning of the page load, waiting with anticipation that this animation is eventually going to start. That was a little unintuitive when I first learned about it, but now I start to get it. Cool. So I would say that's not the most intuitive thing, but is doable. You don't have to download anything else. It's just the CSS. You know, it did take me 46 lines of code to do, but there's nothing else to download. All right. Now, with JavaScript, though, it's going to be way easier. It's going to be a bit more to download because you are loading Greensock, but Greensock isn't that big. It's 36K at the most. You can actually get smaller downloads if you want. You don't have to load the whole thing. So we're going to redo this with Greensock, and to be honest, it's going to be easier with Greensock. Way less lines of code. So same HTML here. Nothing's been animated yet. I did play around with the positioning to make sure the 3D rotation was working the way I wanted to. I did load in Greensock here and a link to our JavaScript file. So let's go into JavaScript here. Now, because we're using Greensock to do the 3D rotation, we have to use this little line of code to set the perspective amount. In CSS, you do that with CSS. But since we're using JavaScript, since we're using Greensock specifically, Greensock, because it's doing the animation of the 3D animation, we have to do it in Greensock. So this just sets that perspective amount so that the 3D rotations will know how much perspective to have. Initially, I just wanted to play with the set amount to set the logo to a certain scale, a certain rotation, just to get it to see, like, okay, does this look good? I think that's a good starting point. It'll end up being normal. But ultimately, I just wanted to get that so I know how I wanted to rotate it. And then I don't need that anymore because this is how it's going to end up looking. So how do we do this? Well, first you define your timeline. So we're going to create a variable that I'm just making up a name. I'm saying, hey, that's timeline. Let's create a timeline light. We don't need the full timeline max. We could just do a timeline light. Timeline max offers more features, but timeline light is enough for this. And we're going to put into that timeline, we're going to put in a from. We're going to animate from, instead of to like we did before, we're going to animate from that scaling amount. So I took all this that I figured out and I just put it in there. So I animate the logo, take 0.5 seconds to do it, so a half second to do it, and animate all those things. But animate from that position, so it'll end up at the current position, but it'll come from that transformed state. Boom. It's way easier than CSS. Just say, start from that other state. If the whole 3D thing is confusing you, just think of scale and let's just think of like a 0.2 scale with an opacity of 0. It just gets bigger. Right? So it fades in and it gets bigger. What you do here, you could do tons of different things. The main thing of Greensock is, what are you going to animate? How long are you going to animate? And then what are all the things you're going to animate? All the different settings. So try not to be confused by the 3D rotation part if that's kind of throwing you off. You can animate any attribute. There's tons of things you can animate. Now, the real shining feature here of Greensock is a stagger from or a stagger to. Now, with stagger from or stagger to, you again have to say what you want to animate, how long do you want to animate it, what do you want to animate. So start from, because remember we're doing a from animation, start from a Y position that's down 100. Start from a 0.9, so like a 90% scale. Now, stagger has an additional parameter, and that is how much time is going to transpire between each animation. So we're telling it, tell everything that's got a class of animate in, and there's a bunch of things, tell them all to animate, but there should be 0.1 seconds of delay between each animation. That's the stagger amount. Look at all those paragraphs. Each one takes 0.8 seconds to animate, but they're each delayed by 0.1 seconds. If I delay them by 0.8 seconds, the same amount of time that it takes to animate them, it'll look a little different. One animates, then the next, because there's no overlap. The more you have of an overlap, the more they kind of all come in as a group, right? Now I could actually even have, like I could say 2 seconds, then there'd actually be a delay between, because each animation only takes 0.8 seconds, but it waits 2 seconds between those animations, so there's a delay between them. That you can change your stagger amount that way, oh my goodness, like that's so much easier than CSS. And seriously, I created 4 lines of code here versus like 40 lines of code in CSS. So you can do it in CSS, but it's definitely more difficult. One other thing, in a timeline, the first thing happens, then the second, and so on. So after this is done, then those animate. In my initial demonstration file, I did have a another position parameter at the end. This one wasn't a plus equals because I want it to be relative to the beginning of the timeline rather than relative to the first object. In this case, it says happen 0.1 seconds after the start of the timeline, instead of happening after the previous elements. And I wanted to just mention that you have complete control. If you don't want to create a sequence of things, you can have something animate relative to the start of the timeline or the end of the previous element. It doesn't matter. The point of that is that you have total control. So now this is going to start to animate, and then this is going to start after 0.1 seconds. So there's going to be some overlap between those. So you have total control over when things animate in Greensock. It's the most powerful way to animate that I know of on the web. You got the most control, and once you get into it, even though the syntax might look a little foreign at first, once you get into it, I was blown away by how much I could do with just a little bit of learning. Sandy at Cohen has a great comment. The staggering is staggering. I love that. That's great. Okay, so we have one more thing to show today, and that is making an animated GIF using After Effects. Now this, we have an exercise that's step by step. So if you want to go through this later and do it yourself, we've got the class files here. You can literally open this up, and all the instructions for everything that I'm going to do, it's all written down here. But I still want to show you live. We're going to have to rip through it real quick because we're starting to run out of time. But I want to do one more animation here in After Effects. Now, After Effects is a bit of a interesting tool if you're used to other Adobe apps. It's a little bit different here. A lot of times we don't build things that we want to animate in After Effects. We build them maybe in Illustrator or Photoshop, and then we import those graphics into After Effects. You can create them in After Effects, but most people find that it's easier to lay things out in Photoshop or Illustrator. We've created a layout in Photoshop, and we're going to import that into After Effects. So we built it in Photoshop because it's easier to build there, but we need to import it into After Effects because it's easier to animate it there. Now, let me just open this up in Photoshop real quick to point out a couple things that we did. Notice, first of all, that there's no artboard. When you create a new file in Photoshop, if you're doing any of the web sizes, they might pre-check on artboards. It's a little bit nicer if you uncheck artboards because the artboard will be converted into a composition within After Effects. And it doesn't make a big deal that it's another nested composition, but it's just another double click that you have to do. So it's just easier just to uncheck artboards. And that goes for animated GIFs as well as anything you're bringing into After Effects. You don't need the artboard, so just uncheck it. That's useful for other things, but not for After Effects. The other thing is it's useful to group sections together, like all the icons, all the class names, all of the in a day stuff. Group sections of things together that you might want to animate together. Like all the class names, we want to animate all of those class names together. So we group them together so we can move them as one whole piece. That's going to be very useful once we get to After Effects. All right. So here in After Effects, I wish I could just import this as the first thing. The only problem with that is when After Effects creates compositions, and it's going to create some compositions from that Photoshop file. It creates them with the last settings that you did previously. So whatever last composition you worked on, whatever frame rate it had, whatever length of the composition, that's the default that's going to be used for the next composition that's created. Even though they're creating them automatically, they're going to use the last settings as a default. There's no way to set the default other than creating a new composition with the settings you want and then just deleting the composition. So we're going to create a new composition here just for the purpose of setting some defaults. I want to set a 30 frames per second default for the frame rate. That's a nice, smooth animation that we're going to get. And the duration. Now, actually, let me just click OK here for a second. Okay. Let me just delete that. Okay. I just wanted to set up After Effects the way that yours would probably be when you first start up. So I want to do the 30 frames per second. Now I need a duration because the next composition will be created with a specific duration. This is the length of time in which you can animate. Right now we're in time code as opposed to frames. Now Photoshop has a limitation of Photoshop animated GIFs are limited to 500 frames. You can't do more than 500 frame animations for animated GIFs in Photoshop. So I don't want to create more than 500 frames in After Effects. I also don't want to create something too short because lengthening it is kind of a pain in the butt. So for right now, I'm going to do 30 seconds. So this is plenty of time for right now, just as a placeholder. This is in time code. If you see like just a number like 000 and there's no colons, then you might be in frames. I'm going to show you how to switch that in just a little bit. But I'm just going to do 30 seconds for right now. That'll be enough time. I only created that just to set those defaults. I will now click on it and delete so that I can import my art, and those will be the defaults for these compositions it's going to make. Let's import that Photoshop file. We want to choose the one that retains layer sizes, and we want to maintain editable layer styles as well so that we can make changes to this stuff as much as possible. So here was a composition, which when I double click on it, we can open up and we can see what's in that composition. And the frame rate and length of that composition was set based on whatever last settings you had done in After Effects. That's why we set that other blank composition, just to preset whatever settings would be used for this. Now, right now I'm seeing time code. When we're doing animated GIFs, I find it much more useful to use frames instead of time code. Time code's more for video. So you can command click on that or control click on Windows, and now we're seeing frames rather than time code. So you just command click or control click to switch. See? So you can't go beyond 500 frames with Photoshop animated GIFs. So I have too much time here. It's easier to cut down than it is to add. So that's why I'm now going to go into my composition settings. And now that I'm seeing frames, I can cut this down to 500. I don't want to have more space than is going to fit into Photoshop. Okay, so that's the biggest that I can create, as up to 500 frames, which is going to be plenty of time for me to work. I'm not going to end up needing that much, but at least I'll have that to work on. And now we can actually start creating our animation. The first thing we're going to do is work on the class names. So let's just temporarily hide the icons and in a day so they don't distract us. We're going to work on these class names. Initially, I want all of these things to slide down. Technically, I want them to slide down in the middle and then as a group to slide over, but let's focus on the sliding in first. Notice I see class names as a group. If I double click on that to go into its composition, now I see all the individual layers because these were individual text layers in Photoshop. I'm going to take all of these, shift click to select the additional ones. I'm going to open up the layers so I can see things that I can animate. I'm going to go to transform. These are things that we can change. So based on the timeline position here, and let's zoom in on this so we can see things a little bit more closely here. You want to change something at, like, let's say at the beginning, I want it to be off screen. And then once I get down to about here, I want it to be back on screen because I want them to slide onto the screen. What's easier is to go here, and this is the right position that I want. So I'm going to come out here to the end where I want it to end up being. And I'm going to click the stopwatch here for position, and that's going to create a keyframe. It's going to remember that position. Now I can come back to the beginning, and I can change the position. There's two settings here. One is for vertical, one is for horizontal offset. See, this one's a horizontal offset. I don't actually want to change that here, so I'm going to undo that. The second one is the vertical offset, and you just drag on that value to slide it up. So that's going to start up at that position, and that's going to then end up back to the beginning because remember we had set a keyframe at the final position. So from there to there, if we hit our space bar, we can see it animate. Now that's kind of boring, just it's not too exciting there. It would be cooler if each one came in a little bit staggered, right? We saw staggered animations, right? So in After Effects, the way that you would do that is by dragging these like this to offset the animations. This is basically what like the animation offset in CSS was doing, is kind of offsetting that. It's like the stagger amount in Greensock. So that's pretty cool. The only thing is I want to make sure that it's exactly equal. So instead of just manually dragging those, let me undo that a bunch of times. We'd want to be more precise. And all these keystrokes and everything are in your exercise. But if you use Command right arrow you can advance one frame at a time. On Windows, that would be Control right arrow. So I'm going to hit Command right arrow 1, 2, 3 times. And then I want to move this to the start of this animation to my playhead. The square bracket, the left square bracket, will move the animation that you have selected, that layer. It'll move it over to the playhead position that you currently have. So that keystroke, by the way, that's square bracket. It's the left square bracket key. So that's the key right there, left square bracket. All these are in your exercise. So right arrow, Command right arrow, 1, 2, 3. Select this, hit square bracket. 1, 2, 3, square bracket. 1, 2, 3, square bracket. 1, 2, 3. And so this way, at least, I'm being precise to make sure that I'm getting the exact right offset. There are more advanced, complex ways to do this a bit more automatically, but we wanted to go over more the concept of timelines here and not get into stuff that wasn't quite as intuitive. Okay, so that's cooler, but it kind of just goes plunk, 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 plunk. It doesn't slow down at the end. I'd like it to slow down at the end. Go easy at the end. So for that, I need to open up and see these keyframes again. The only thing is I see all these parameters that I didn't animate. So After Effects has a cool little trick where if you select all your layers, you can hit U to just show the parameters that you changed. And normally I don't like to get into keystrokes all this much right away, but just After Effects, you need to learn some keystrokes, and U is a very useful keystroke. And these are all in your exercise, by the way, that PDF. Now I can shift click these additional keyframes at the end. I don't want the beginning ones because I just want it to slow down at the end. By the way, you can drag over them. Just be careful you don't get the start keyframes. So I could shift drag over those just to get those. Now with them all selected, I can right click or control click, and I can go here to Easy Ease. And that's going to add a little bit of slowness at the ends. And so it just slows down a little bit at the end. Just makes it look a little more natural. That's better. Okay, now that I'm done with that composition, I can close that composition and come back to the main one. And we can see that all that happens here in the main composition. But I do want that initially, all that stuff to happen in the center and then slide over here. So let's go out here to around 50 frames, which gives me, see if that ends around here, it's going to give me a little bit more time to animate over to this position. So we're going to go and tell that class name. And this whole composition, we can move as one whole chunk. That's a great use of those groups in Photoshop to make a whole composition that you can move as one big chunk. And we're going to remember this position by keyframing that. Then we're going to come back just a little bit after the animation's done. So like right around here, the animation's all done. And I'm going to slide this over to here. This is where I want that to start out being. So it animates from here over to there. So this is the starting place. Now, so before that, we still have that nested composition animation happening, but the starting position is that it's all happening here. Then it slides over to there. Now let's do the class icons. We'll tell those class icons, let's zoom in on this. We're going to have them end at this position, and then we're going to come back to here, and we're going to have them start off screen. So let's go back here and hit the play button. I'm hitting the space bar for the play button. That's kind of cool. And now let's do one more thing here. In a day, transform. We'll start. Oh, I got to show that first of all. We're going to start it. We're going to end at this position. And then we're going to come back here, and we're going to slide that off the screen. So that's sliding on with everything else. All right, so here we go. There we go. Cool. All right. We can, because this is After Effects, we can add motion blur if you want it to have like a little bit of blur as things are moving. For that, you have to do two things though. First, you have to check on this switch, which enables motion blur for the file. But you also have to go into each composition and turn on motion blur for each element. And you can do that by double clicking on a composition and then sliding through, just dragging through that column to enable motion blur. So if you want to enable it on all the layers, it does take a little bit of work because you have to go into each nested composition. It takes a little bit of work. But now notice as I drag, see that there's some motion blur. So as it's moving, it's blurred, but then it comes to an end and it's not blurred anymore. It's just being blurred. The faster it's moving, the more it's being blurred. See, that's something unique to After Effects that is not easy to do in something like Photoshop. Cool. When I'm all done here, I do want to have some time where it sits on this. Like all these things animate in. And then, I want people to be able to read this. So probably around now is maybe when I want it to restart. So, let's say like 170 frames I think is enough. So remember we started at 500, but we're going to trim it down to 170 because I don't need all the rest. So we just go back to our composition settings and we cut it back down to what we actually need, 170. So now, hitting the space bar, this is how long it sits on it, and then it restarts. Cool. So we've got an animation, but it's not an animated GIF. We have to render that out of After Effects. We have to render out something we could take into Photoshop to actually turn into an animated GIF. So we're going to add this to the render queue. This is going to render out something. Normally in After Effects you render out a video, but in this case, the output is going to be a PNG sequence. Photoshop can import a PNG sequence, which is just every frame is a PNG file. Where are we going to output this? Let's click on this output to on my desktop. We're going to output it here. Definitely save it in a subfolder because you're going to get a ton of stuff in this folder, just tons of files. Okay. Render is going to render out all of those frames as individual PNG files. Let's go see what it does. Say, look at each individual PNG file. I'm just hitting my arrow keys here to flip through them all. You get a different PNG for each frame of the animation. Cool. So now we can take that into Photoshop and turn it into an animated GIF. So you open the file, PSD layout. You open the first one, but make sure you show options if you don't see them. You got to check on image sequence so that it knows to open them all as an animation. 30 frames per second is what we did in After Effects, so that's what we'll do here. We can open up our timeline, and there we go. We're seeing the same thing that we saw in After Effects. Okay. Let's go back. There we go. Now we just need to export it. File, export, save for web. GIF. 170 frames, just like we had in After Effects. You can choose your number of colors that you need, optimize it, get it to be what you need. 348K is the current file size. Might be able to get that down a little bit smaller. You'd have to play with it. It's not so bad there. 277 still looks pretty good. Okay. Now, let me give you one really kind of secret tip here about a trick. Notice that this says 170 frames. Okay. Let me hit done for a second. Technically, the animation's done around here. Now, we're seeing time code here. I'm going to go into my panel options here under this little menu, panel options, and I'm going to switch over to frame numbers because frame numbers are more useful. Right around there. So frame 51 and on are all the same. None of this changes. So if you want to do, remember I told you about that 500 frame limit? What if you want to do more than what, like let's say in After Effects, let's say you have something at 750 frames. If there's a time through which nothing changes, technically we only need 51 frames for this animation. We don't need 170. There's nothing changing at the end here. So there's a secret. Go to figure out whatever that last frame is there and select the video group so your new thing will be imported on top of that. But since this is frame 51 and from here on out it's all the same, it's like a static image, we can place frame 51 here, and it will treat it like a static thing as one frame for the whole rest of the animation. It's the same thing. It's animating before that, but once it hits frame 51, it just sits on that. Nothing actually changes. Now, to get this to work, the real trick is to put that in there, but you have to remove the video part for this to work. You have to actually remove this. Even though in theory that should work just to put it on top, you actually have to cut the video back. So the video portion is only in the beginning, and then basically you're just sitting there on that one picture for a really long time. And now when you go to Save for Web, you're going to see that it worked, because now it says 52 of 52 frames. Before, that said 170, which is what I imported from After Effects. That's like a super secret trick that not a lot of people know. Anyway, so now I can hit save. I can go to my desktop, and I can call it final. Final last words, right? Final animation. Let me just open that up. Final GIF. And here is the animated GIF from After Effects. Pretty cool stuff. So in our presentation, at the beginning of the presentation, you can download all the demo files that I showed, the PDF exercise, all that stuff. Just to finish up here, this is the last slide of my demonstration in these online slides here. We've got classes in Photoshop animated GIFs, HTML5 animation with Greensock, responsive CSS3 scrolling effects if you want to do some animation in CSS, and After Effects. Now, most of them, we have a class and a book available. The classes you can take in person in New York City, or you can take them live online. So, for example, animated GIFs is a 3-hour class. You can do a live stream online or take it in person. You do have to attend. These are all Eastern time. You do have to attend live if you're doing the online version of it. Or if you can't take the class, you still want to go through the exercises, you can buy the workbook, which you could buy in print or an ebook. So you can do an instant download, go through these exercises, and learn how to do this stuff. That's available for any of the classes that we offer, but Greensock is a little unique. We have a class that you can do in person or online. We have the ebook, but we also have pre-recorded videos. This is the only course that we've done this with so far, but you can buy this as a video course. So that, kind of like I'm doing these demonstrations, you watch videos, and then you do an exercise in the book. So it's just like taking a class, except instead of a live instructor you're watching pre-recorded videos. Carl Schoof of Greensock. We actually have one of the great guys from Greensock. It's Carl Schoof, and the original founder is Jack Doyle. Carl Schoof of Greensock is actually teaching you how to use Greensock. So there's a video demonstration and an exercise. So you watch and you learn, and then you do an exercise to practice it, because it's important to understand it, but it's also important to do it yourself so you really learn it. So this is another great option for learning. So if you don't want to wait for a class and you just want to do it now, but you want someone teaching you through videos, it's a great format. You watch the video, you do an exercise in the book. You watch the next video, do another exercise in the book. It's like a 1-2 combination that's just a complete learning package, and that is also available. So you can buy the ebook if you don't want the videos, or you can buy the ebook plus the videos, and then it's like having a course that you can watch anytime. So it's another great option for learning Greensock. For learning Greensock, though, we do recommend that you know HTML, CSS, that you're familiar with that, and some prior experience with JavaScript, because, of course, it is JavaScript. So you should be able to build up your content with HTML and CSS and have some familiarity with JavaScript. You don't have to be a total expert, but just have some familiarity that you've done some JavaScript before going into doing the Greensock book or video course. I'm going to hang around in the live chat here in case people want to hang out and ask me questions, but just want to say thanks for coming, everybody. Hope you enjoyed the course or today's live stream, and hope to see you again in maybe one of our live courses, whether you're in New York City or doing the live stream online. And don't forget about those ebooks. They're a great way to learn if you can't make it for one of our classes. Do an instant download. You can also buy the print book, and you definitely want to, if you're going through a book, whether it's an ebook or a print book, be able to see the book while you're working on your computer, because you want to be able to read the instructions. And you read the instructions on your ebook or your print book, and then you're working on your computer as you're going through it. All of our stuff works on Mac and PC as long as the apps work on both. All right, so be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. So like this video. If you like the video, hit the thumbs up button down below. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for notifications in the future. Thanks for coming, everybody. Hope to see you in the future. And like I said, for those that are attending live, I will be hanging out in the live chat. But thanks for coming. Hit the thumbs up and subscribe. See you in a future live stream. Thanks a lot for coming.